calls for the collapse of sustained reading. In the west end of Provincetown, there's a gorgeous bookstore named Tim's Used Books. You walk in and you immediately inhale the tangy musk that comes from having old books stacked everywhere. I went in almost every other day that summer to buy another book to read. There was a young woman who worked at the cash register who was really smart, and I took to chatting with her. I noticed that every time I went in, she was reading a different book. One day, Vladimir Nabokov. Another day, Joseph Conrad. Another day, Shirley Jackson. Wow, I said, you read fast. Oh, she replied, I don't. I can only read the first chapter or two of a book. I asked, really? Why? She said, I guess I can't focus. Here was an intelligent young woman with lots of time, surrounded by many of the best books ever written, and with a desire to read them. But she could only get through the first chapter or two, and then her attention petered out like a failing engine. I have lost count of how many people I know who have told me this. When I first met him, David Ulin, who was a book critic and editor at the Los Angeles Times for more than 30 years, told me that he had lost his ability to read deeply over long periods because whenever he tried to settle down, he kept being drawn back to the buzz of the online conversation. This is an incredibly smart man whose whole life had been books. It was disconcerting. The proportion of Americans who read books for pleasure is now at its lowest level ever recorded. The American Time News survey, which studies a representative sample of 26,000 Americans, found that between 2004 and 2017, the proportion of men reading for pleasure had fallen by 40%, while for women it was down by 29%. The opinion poll company Gallup found that the proportion of Americans who never read a book in any given year tripled between 1978 and 2014. Some 57% of Americans now do not read a single book in a typical year. This has escalated to the point that by 2017, the average American spent 17 minutes a day reading books and 5.4 hours on their phone. Complex literary fiction is particularly suffering. For the first time in modern history, less than half of Americans read literature for pleasure. It's been less well studied. But there seem to be similar trends in Britain and other countries. Between 2008 and 2016, the market for novels fell by 40%. In one single year, 2011, paperback fiction sales collapsed by 26%. Mihari had discovered in his research that one of the simplest and most common forms of flow that people experience in their lives is reading a book. And like other forms of flow, it is being chalked off in our culture of constant distraction. I thought a lot about this. For many of us, reading a book is the deepest form of focus we experience. You dedicate many hours of your life coolly, calmly to one topic and allow it to marinate in your mind. This is the medium through which most of the deepest advances in human thought over the past 400 years have been figured out and explained, and that experience is now in free fall. In Provincetown, I noticed I wasn't just reading more, I was reading differently. I was becoming much more deeply immersed in the books I had chosen. I got lost in them for really long stretches, sometimes whole days, and I felt like I was understanding and remembering more of what I read. I seemed like I traveled further in that deck chair by the sea, reading book after book, than I had in the previous 5 years of shuttling frantically around the world. I went from fighting on the battlefields of the Napoleon Wars to being an enslaved person in the deep south, to being an Israeli mother trying to avoid hearing the news that her son has been killed. As I reflected on this, I started to think again about a book I had read 10 years before, The Shallow by Nicholas Carr, a landmark work that really alerted people to a crucial aspect of the growing attention crisis. He warned that the way we are reading seems to be changing as we migrate to the internet. So I went back to one of the key experts in Truan to see what she has learned since. Anne Mangan is a professor of literacy at Stavanger University in Norway, and she explained to me that in 2 decades of researching this subject, she has proved something crucial. Reading books trains us to read in particular way, in a linear fashion, focused on one thing for a sustained period. Reading from screens, she has discovered, trains us to read in a different way. In a manic skip and jump from one thing to another, we are more likely to scan and skim when we read on screens. Our studies have found. We run our eyes rapidly over the information to extract what we need. But after a while, if we do this long enough, she told me that this scanning and skimming bleeds over. It also starts to color or influence how we read on paper. That behavior also becomes our default, more or less. It was precisely what I had noticed when I tried to settle into Dickens when I arrived in Provincetown and found myself rushing ahead of him, as if it was a news article and I was trying to push for the key facts. This creates a different relationship with reading. It stops being a form of pleasurable immersion in another world and becomes more like dashing around a busy supermarket to grab what you need and then get out again. When this flip takes place, when our screen reading contaminates our book reading, we lose some of the pleasures of reading books themselves, and they become less appealing. It has other knock on effects. Anne has conducted studies that split people into two groups, where one is given information in a printed book and the other is given the same information on a screen. Everyone is then asked questions about what they just read. When you do this, you find that people understand and remember less of what they absorb on screens. There's broad scientific evidence for this now, emerging from 54 studies, and she explained that it's referred to as screen inferiority. This gap in understanding between books and screen is big enough that in elementary school children it's the equivalent of 2/3 of a year's growth in reading comprehension. As she spoke, I realized that the collapse in reading books is, in some ways, a symptom of our atrophying attention, and in some ways, a cause of it. It's a spiral. As we began to move from books to screens, we started to lose some of the capacity for the deeper reading that comes from books, and that in turn made us less likely to read books. It's like when you gain weight and it gets harder and harder to exercise. As a result, Anne told me she was worried we are now losing our ability to read a long text anymore. And we are also losing our cognitive patience and the stamina and the ability to deal with cognitively challenging text. When I was at Harvard conducting interviews, one professor told me that he struggled to get his students there to read even quite short books, and he increasingly offered them podcasts and YouTube clips they could watch instead. And that's Harvard. I started to wonder what happens to a world where this form of deep focus shrinks so far and so fast. What happens when that deepest layer of thinking becomes available to fewer and fewer people until it is a small minority interest, like opera or volleyball? As I wandered the streets of Provincetown contemplating some of these questions, I found myself thinking back over a famous idea that I now realized I had never really understood before, one that was also mulled in a different way by Nicholas Carr in his book. In the 1960s, the Canadian professor Marshall McLuhan talked a lot about how the arrival of television was transforming the way we see the world. He said these changes were so deep and so profound that it was hard to really see them. When he tried to distill this down into a phrase, he explained that the medium is the message. What he meant, I think, was that when a new technology comes along, you think of it as like a pipe. Somebody pours in information at one end and you receive it unfiltered at the other. But it's not like that. Every time a new medium comes along, whether it's the invention of the printed book or TV or Twitter, and you start to use it, it's like you are putting on a new kind of goggles, each with their own special colors and lenses. Each set of goggles you put on makes you see things differently. So, for example, when you start to watch television, before you absorb the message of any particular TV show, whether it's Wheel of Fortune or The Wire, you start to see the world as being shaped like television itself. That's why McLuhan said that every time a new medium comes along, a new way for humans to communicate, it has buried in it a message. It is gently guiding us to see the world according to a new set of codes. The way information gets to you, McLuhan argued, is more important than the information itself. TV teaches you that the world is fast, that it's about for surfaces and appearances, that everything in the world is happening all at once. This made me wonder what the message is that we absorb from social media and how it compares to the message that we absorb from printed books. I thought first of Twitter. When you log into that site, It doesn't matter whether you are Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Booba the Love Sponge. You are absorbing a message through that medium and sending it out to your followers. What is that message? First, that you shouldn't focus on any one thing for long. The word can and should be understood in short, simple statements of 280 characters. Second, the word should be interpreted and confidently understood very quickly. Third, what matters most is whether people immediately agree with and applaud your short, simple, speedy statements. A successful statement is one that lots of people immediately applaud. An unsuccessful statement is one that people immediately ignore or condemn. When you tweet before you say anything else, you are saying that at some level you agree with these three premises. You are putting on those goggles and seeing the world through them. How about Facebook? What's the message in that medium? It seems to be first, your life exists to be displayed to other people, and you should be aiming every day to show your friends edited highlights of your life. Second, what matters is whether people immediately like these edited and carefully selected highlights that you spend your life crafting. Third, somebody is your friend if you regularly look at their edited highlight reels and they look at yours. This is what friendship means. How about Instagram? First, what matters is how you look on the outside. Second, what matters is how you look on the outside. Third, what matters is how you look on the outside. Fourth, what matters is whether people like how you look on the outside. I don't mean this glibly or sarcastically. That really is the message the site offers. I realized one of the key reasons why social media makes me feel so out of joint with the world and with myself